Third question is, to what extent is climate change precipitated by failures in the economic system? How can excessive consumption be reduced and resources redirected towards poverty alleviation, employment creation, and sustainable resource management? So this goes to the heart of the economic questions of the issue. Then there's intergenerational responsibilities. How can agreement be reached on the value and desired quality of life of future generations? Can we put a value on that? How much money, time, and resources are countries willing to invest now in mitigation and adaptation measures to benefit future generations? The final question I'll raise here is about scientific knowledge. Is access to scientific knowledge on climate change a universal right? If so, how can this knowledge be translated into necessary adaptation and mitigation strategies? There was a really interesting article in the Herald Tribune about they chose two countries dealing with very similar issues, such as rising sea levels, and chose how a country in Africa had absolutely no access to technology to deal with this issue versus what they were able to do in the Netherlands, building homes on floating platforms so that they could adjust with the rising tides. And the only difference, same problem, you know, all human beings, the only difference was access to resources and scientific knowledge. These are complicated issues which require the participation and input not only of governments, but of scientists, academia, and religious communities. Recently, the Baha'i international community decided to put its money where our mouth is, so to speak, and try to apply an ethical approach to the issue of climate change and bring it to the policy discussions at the UN. So Sylvia and Arthur both mentioned the Commission for Sustainable Development that we were all a part of this year at the UN. As many of you know, one of the priorities of the work of the Baha'i International Community's United Nations Office is sustainable development. So most years, I think every year, we've brought a delegation of Baha'i experts, and sometimes non-Baha'i experts, to the Commission for Sustainable Development, which is a functional commission of the UN comprising 53 governments, and is the high-level forum for governments and other stakeholders to discuss issues of environment and sustainable development. One of the topics, as they said this year, was climate change. The question we had was, what could a faith-based organization bring to this somewhat contentious subject that would be useful and would fit with our approach of principle-based problem solving? We decided to focus our efforts on the ethical dimensions of climate change. We invited about 5 different experts from different fields to make a presentation on the ethical dimensions of climate change. We asked them to consider this question: what are the moral and ethical issues of climate change, and what practical difference would it make if they were integrated fully into decision-making by policymakers? We invited the former ambassador of Tuvalu, a UN official representing small island developing states and least developed countries, a scientist from Columbia, a climate scientist from Columbia University, a lawyer who's done a lot of work on the ethics of climate change, a Jewish representative, and the president of the International Environment Forum, Arthur Dahl. We offered this event to the CSD, and it was accepted as a side event of the commission, which happens sort of during lunchtime, and people are free to attend whatever they want during that time. The response to the approach we took at that event was overwhelming. Government delegates, UN staff, and NGO colleagues all expressed their appreciation for the BIC for initiating such a discussion at the Commission. Individuals asked us to continue working on this issue, and the BIC was the only individual NGO asked to present to the European Union delegation to the Commission on this subject and our work on it. We also had big articles published in the daily newsletters of the Commission, and one of the audience members filmed the event and asked if she could post it on YouTube. She did so, and I think so far we've had over 1,800 hits or so. It's also been picked up by over 20 other websites. This was the other thing I wanted to mention is the Children and Youth Caucus felt so strongly about the issue that in their formal statements to governments, they appealed to governments for, quote, a new level of global consensus and cooperation among governments, who should rise above political and economic considerations and focus on addressing the fundamental underlying ethical and moral dimensions. this resulted in a very lively debate with the chair of the commission from Qatar about energy use. So it really got people talking. The strength of the panel was that, I think, in looking back on it, was that we invited scientific, policy, and religious representatives to speak to the issue. We didn't pretend to know the answers. In fact, we didn't present an official Baha'i position on the issue. Rather, we facilitated a dialogue. Since then, we've been asked to present on this subject a few other times and facilitated another workshop focusing more on small island developing states and the gender aspect of climate change in September. So since this time, the Baha'i international community has begun to think about what we would like to offer to this discussion. We feel that climate change is not only a threat, but a unique opportunity to learn to speak a different language, to operate in a new manner, to act and think in a principled rather than particularistic manner. We suggest a principled approach that includes consideration of the ethical dimensions of climate change, which must be part of the discourse on climate policy. There are two advantages to a principled approach. First of all, it makes explicit the values underlying analysis and decision-making, which is what we were talking about earlier. It also helps to establish and prioritize goals against a complex backdrop of economic, social, and political considerations. So building on the principles put forward in the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and guided by the vision of a just and sustainable global community, we offer just 3 principles at this point for your consideration. The first is the principle of international solidarity. The principle of solidarity is not merely a call to international cooperation. Rather, adherence to such a principle has implications for the administrative, economic, and social structures of society. Today, these structures are predominantly reflective of a nationalistic and divided world. But the principle of international solidarity underlines the fundamental interconnectedness between the conditions and fates of nations and peoples. Nations must expand their understanding of who belongs to their community of concern, so that this includes, in addition to their fellow citizens currently alive, people in other nations and future generations.